My fiance's family required a premarital medical exam, so I examined my options and ran. My fiance Augustin was 36. Augustin was from a wealthy, very traditional family. On a Sunday in November, 6 weeks before our wedding, his mother Bellatrix called me to her sitting room and explained over tea that I'd be needing to attend a family physician of theirs for a standard health clearance before the wedding. I listened. I asked what kind of clearance. Bellatrix told me, very smoothly, that it was about fertility planning and ensuring the family's medical history was complete, that all the women in our family go. I was a 32-year-old internal medicine doctor. What Bellatrix didn't know is that I knew exactly what she was describing, and that there is no such thing as a legitimate standard health clearance for a fiance. I said I'd think about it. I drove home and didn't tell Augustin. The dumber she thinks I am, the more rope she'll hand me. That night, I called a colleague, an OBGYN named Persephone. I told her the name of the family physician Bellatrix had given me. Persephone went very quiet. Then she told me that doctor's name had been on a private list among OBGYNs in our state. A list of doctors who, for the right family, would perform invasive examinations on women and write reports about a woman's medical history to her future in-laws, that this wasn't a legitimate fertility workup, that this was a control instrument, that fiancés in this network had been sent to him for years, that the reports always went to the mother-in-law, that the brides did not, that some brides who received unsatisfactory reports had their weddings quietly called off by the family without the brides ever being told why, that several brides had been lied to about their own medical conditions to manufacture cause to break the engagement. I didn't cry. I did the cold thing instead. I called another colleague, a patient rights attorney named Catalina. I told her everything. Then I did what every doctor wants to do when they see a system feeding women into a meat grinder. I agreed to the appointment, with a wire, with Catalina coordinating with the state medical board in advance, with a second physician, a woman, a witness, an OBGYN named Magdalena, who agreed to come with me as my support person and refused to leave the room. The appointment was ugly. The doctor was visibly thrown by the second physician. He tried to send Magdalena out, was told no, firmly, in language only one doctor uses to another doctor. The recording caught the doctor explaining to Magdalena, when he thought he was being collegial, exactly what kind of report Bellatrix had been wanting, in his own words, on tape. I walked out of that office and drove straight to a hotel. I didn't go home. I called Augustin from the hotel. I told him I needed 48 hours alone before the wedding. I watched what he did with those hours. What he did was call his mother 6 times before he called me back. That was the answer. I didn't go back to him. I called off the wedding by certified letter the next morning, with the recording attached, with Catalina CC'd, with the state medical board's complaint number on the letterhead. The doctor was being investigated within a week. His license was suspended within a month. The investigation found 11 other women's reports in his files who had been put through what I refused. Bellatrix wasn't facing criminal charges. She had been a careful woman, and careful women rarely sign anything. But the civil suits, brought by some of those 11 women I'd been quietly connecting them to, were ruinous to the family. But here's the thing. Among those 11 women's files, when the investigators finally let me see the redacted version, was one I recognized. A name, dated 19 years ago. Bellatrix's own daughter-in-law, Augustin's older brother's wife, who had died in childbirth 18 years ago, whose report from this same doctor had been incomplete, and whose newborn daughter had been raised by Bellatrix herself ever since. I sat in that hotel room for 3 hours staring at the redacted file. Half the name was blacked out, but I'm a doctor. I know how to fill in gaps. The name was Larissa Watson. I knew who that was. Larissa married Ajax, Augustin's older brother, 19 years ago. Larissa had a baby. Larissa reportedly died during delivery. The baby, now 18 years old, had been raised entirely by Bellatrix. I sat on that hotel bed with my laptop open, and I searched everything. There was no public obituary for Larissa Watson. I could not find a death certificate online. For a woman who married into one of the wealthiest families in the area, who had a baby, who supposedly died, there was nothing. Just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't happen by accident. The kind of silence that costs money. I picked up the phone and called Persephone. It was almost midnight. Persephone picked up on the second ring like she'd been waiting. I read her every detail from the redacted report. Persephone was quiet while I read, and then she said, "That file is flagged incomplete because the doctor never submitted a final report to any hospital. Not to the delivery hospital. Not to her OB. Not to anyone in the medical system." I asked her where the report went. Persephone said, "He submitted it only to Bellatrix." She let that sit for a second. That means whatever he found, Bellatrix was the only person who ever saw the full version. I sat there holding my phone. A medical report about a woman who died, and the only copy of the full version went to her mother-in-law. Not to a hospital. Not to the coroner. To Bellatrix. The next morning I called Catalina. I asked her whether the medical board investigation could unseal Larissa's full file. Catalina is sharp. She doesn't waste words. She told me Larissa's file was complicated. Catalina said, "If she's deceased, her medical records belong to her estate. And guess who controls her estate?" I didn't even need to answer. Bellatrix. Of course it was Bellatrix. I made a decision sitting in that hotel room. I was not going to let this go. I told Catalina I wanted to find out if Larissa was actually dead. Catalina went quiet for a few seconds. Then she said, "You already took down their doctor and called off the wedding. If you go after this, you're not just leaving the family. You're declaring war on it." I said, "They declared war on me 6 weeks ago. I just didn't know the body count yet." Catalina didn't argue. She just said she'd start looking into how to get around the estate issue. While all of this was happening, my phone had been lighting up. Augustin had called me 12 times in 4 hours. I watched every single call come in, and I let it ring. On the 13th call, I picked up. His voice was tight. He said, "My mother is beside herself. She says you recorded her doctor. She says you're trying to destroy us." I didn't yell. I asked him one question. "Did you know about the exam?" He hesitated. That hesitation was longer than any answer could have been. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. In those 3 seconds, I heard everything I needed to hear. Then he said, "It's just something the family does. It's not a big deal." I hung up. I didn't say goodbye. The next morning, I drove to the county records office. I asked the clerk to search for a death certificate for Larissa Watson. The clerk typed it in and turned the screen slightly and said they had one on file. My chest did something funny, because part of me had been thinking maybe there wouldn't be one. Maybe Larissa was alive somewhere. there. Maybe she got out. She didn't get out. The death certificate was right there on the screen. Cause of death, complications during childbirth. The attending physician's name was right there at the bottom. The signature. It was not the family doctor. It was someone I had never heard of. I wrote the name down on the back of a receipt and folded it into my pocket. I walked back to my car and called Persephone. I read her the name of the attending physician. Persephone said she'd check. I could hear her typing. She came back after a few minutes and told me the doctor retired 8 years ago. No disciplinary history. Clean record. For a second, I felt like I'd hit a wall, but then Persephone said, wait, the hospital listed on the death certificate, the facility where Larissa supposedly gave birth and died, was a small private facility. Persephone said, that place was barely a hospital. It was more like a private clinic, the kind of place where records could disappear. She told me it closed 12 years ago. Whatever files they had could be anywhere. In a storage unit, in a basement, in a dumpster. A woman died in a place that no longer exists, treated by a doctor who no longer practices, and the only full report of what happened to her went to her mother-in-law. I was starting to understand how Bellatrix built this, not with one big lie, with 100 small silences, a clinic that closes, a doctor who retires, a file that stays incomplete. You don't need to cover up a crime if you build the whole system so that nobody is ever in a position to see it. That afternoon, Catalina called me. Her voice sounded different, tight. She said, Bellatrix moved fast. Bellatrix had retained a law firm, a big one. They had already sent a cease and desist letter to me, personally. The letter claimed I had obtained the recording illegally. It threatened to sue me for invasion of privacy, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Catalina said, the claims are weak. The state is a one-party consent jurisdiction for this type of interaction. The defamation claim has no legs. Then she paused. But that's not the point. She's not trying to win in court. She's trying to bury you in legal fees so you stop digging. It was smart. Bellatrix was always smart. I sat on the edge of my hotel bed and I thought about stopping. The wedding was off. The doctor was suspended. 11 women were pursuing civil suits. I had done enough. For about 10 minutes, I almost convinced myself it was time to go. Then I thought about the girl, Larissa's daughter, 18 years old, living in Bellatrix's house, being raised by the same woman who sent her mother to a doctor who reported on her body, who sent her to a clinic that barely counted as a hospital, who took the baby before Larissa was even cold. That girl had no idea. I picked up the phone and called Catalina back. I said, I need to talk to Ajax. Catalina was quiet for a second. Then she said, that is a terrible idea. She started listing the reasons. Ajax is Bellatrix's oldest son. He lives on the family property. He has never publicly questioned anything his mother has done. Catalina said, you'd be walking into the lion's den. I heard everything she said. I said, Ajax lost his wife. Either he knows what really happened or he doesn't. Either way, I need to see his face when I ask. Catalina was quiet. Then she said she couldn't stop me, but she wanted me to be careful. I drove to the family property on a Wednesday afternoon. I picked Wednesday because I knew Bellatrix had a standing appointment at her club every Wednesday at 2. I had a 40-minute window. I drove past the main estate and kept going down the private road behind it until I got to Ajax's house. It sat behind the main property like an afterthought, smaller, quieter. I parked and I sat in my car for about 30 seconds, just breathing. Then I got out and walked to the front door and knocked. Ajax opened the door. The first thing I noticed was how old he looked. Not old like a number. Old like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. He was only a few years older than Augustin, but he could have passed for 10 years more. He looked at me standing on his doorstep, and he did not look surprised. He just looked at me like he had been expecting this visit for a long time, and it had finally come. He stepped aside and let me in without a word. I walked into his kitchen and sat down at his table across from him. The kitchen was clean but bare. No pictures on the fridge. Just a table, 2 chairs, and a window that faced the back of his mother's house. I told him I was not there to cause trouble. I told him I wasn't recording anything. Then I told him I found Larissa's name in the doctor's files. When I said her name, Ajax's hands went still on the table, completely still, like someone had pressed pause on just that part of him. He looked at me and he said, I was wondering when someone would find that. His voice was flat, like a man who had been waiting for a shoe to drop for almost 2 decades, and was almost relieved to finally hear it hit the floor. I asked him what happened to Larissa. Ajax didn't answer right away. Then he said, Larissa failed the exam. I asked him what he meant by that. He looked down at his hands. My mother's doctor told my mother that Larissa had a medical condition, something that would make pregnancy difficult. My mother told Larissa the wedding was off. The same system, the same playbook. A doctor examines the bride. The doctor reports to Bellatrix. Bellatrix decides. I asked, but you married her anyway. Ajax nodded. I told my mother I didn't care. That was the first time I ever said no to her. It was also the last. When he said that, I thought about Augustin on the phone saying, it's just something the family does. Augustin never said no. Not once. Ajax said no once for Larissa, and it cost him everything. Ajax kept talking. He told me that after the wedding, Bellatrix cut them off. No money, no support. He said it was like they stopped existing. He said Larissa got a job. They lived in a small apartment and they were happy. Actually happy, for the first time since he could remember. Then Larissa got pregnant. There were complications. Larissa was sick for months. The doctors she was seeing through her regular insurance were worried. Ajax did the only thing he could think of. He went back to his mother. He begged her. Bellatrix agreed. But she had a condition. Larissa had to go to the private clinic Bellatrix chose. Bellatrix's clinic. Bellatrix's doctor. Larissa went. Larissa never came home. When Ajax said that, his voice didn't crack. It just went empty. He said, they told me it was a hemorrhage. They told me there was nothing anyone could do. They handed me my daughter and my mother was standing right there, already reaching for her. I could see it. Bellatrix standing in a hospital hallway with her hands out, reaching for a baby that wasn't hers, while her oldest son stood there covered in the worst day of his life. I asked Ajax if he ever questioned it. His eyes filled. Not all the way. He said, every single day. But I had a newborn. I had no money. My mother had the house, the lawyers, the name. She told me she would raise the baby because I clearly couldn't. And I was so broken that I believed her. He stopped talking for a minute. I let him. When he started talking again, he said something that changed everything. He said, 6 months ago, I found a letter. He told me that Larissa wrote it before she went to the clinic. She hid it in a book he never read. A novel on a shelf in their old apartment that he had kept in a box for 18 years without ever opening. He said he only found it because he was cleaning out a closet. He told me what the letter said. Larissa wrote that she was scared. scared. The doctor Bellatrix was sending her to was the same doctor who examined her before the wedding, the same one. She wrote that she didn't trust him. She wrote that if anything happened to her, Ajax should get the baby out of that house. I asked Ajax where the letter was. He stood up from the table. He walked to a drawer by the sink. He pulled out a folded piece of paper inside a plastic bag. He brought it back to the table and set it in front of me. He said, "I've been carrying this for 6 months. I didn't know who to give it to. I didn't know who would believe me. My mother owns everyone." I looked at that letter through the plastic. I could see the handwriting, small and neat and slanting slightly to the right. I picked it up. My hands were steady. I looked at Ajax and I said, "She doesn't own me." I brought that letter straight to Catalina. I put it on her desk and I stood there while she read it. Catalina reads fast, but she read that letter slow. When she finished, she didn't say anything for a full minute. Then she said, "This isn't just a medical board complaint anymore. This is a wrongful death investigation. If the doctor who treated Larissa at that clinic is the same doctor whose license we just suspended, and if Bellatrix directed Larissa to that clinic knowing this doctor had already flagged her as medically unfit, then Bellatrix didn't just control the exam process. She controlled the outcome." Catalina moved fast after that. She contacted the state medical board's investigator. What came back was worse than I expected. Godwin Marks, the same doctor whose license we had just gotten suspended, also had privileges at the now closed private clinic where Larissa died. His name was on internal clinic records as a consulting physician during Larissa's delivery. The attending physician who signed the death certificate, the clean doctor with the clean record, was a colleague of Godwin's. The investigator told Catalina, "We need to reopen the circumstances of that death." That same week, Augustin called me one final time. His voice was flat, controlled, like someone had coached him on what to say. He said, "My mother told me what you're doing. She says you're trying to destroy our family because I didn't choose you over her." I said, "I'm not destroying your family, Augustin. I'm looking at what your family already destroyed." He said, "She's my mother." I said, "And Larissa was Ajax's wife, and that girl is Larissa's daughter, and your mother made sure none of that mattered." He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "If you do this, I can't protect you." I said, "You never did." The next call came from Bellatrix herself. Her voice was perfectly smooth. She said, "I'd like to meet with you, just the two of us, woman to woman." I said, "I understand exactly how it works. You send women to a doctor who reports to you. You decide who stays and who goes. And when someone stays who you didn't approve of, you make sure they don't last." Bellatrix was silent for 3 seconds. Then she said, "You are making a very serious accusation." I said, "I'm not making an accusation. The state medical board is, and they have Larissa's letter." That's when her composure cracked. I heard it in her voice, this tiny split. She said, "That letter is meaningless. A scared pregnant woman writing nonsense." I said, "Then why are you calling me about it?" Bellatrix hung up. It was the last time we ever spoke. The investigation into Larissa's death took 3 months. Godwin Marks's consulting records from the clinic showed he recommended against a procedure that could have saved Larissa's life during delivery, citing the same medical condition from her pre-marital exam. 2 independent physicians reviewed the records and confirmed Larissa never had that condition. She never had it. It was made up, written into a file by a doctor who answered to Bellatrix, and then used 18 years later to let a woman bleed out on a table. The original attending physician was contacted during the investigation. He admitted that Godwin told him not to intervene aggressively. He said the family had accepted the risk. I didn't ask whose family he meant. Godwin's license was permanently revoked. A wrongful death case was filed on behalf of Larissa's estate. Ajax, as her surviving spouse, authorized it. It was the second time in his life he said no to his mother. Bellatrix was named in the civil suit. Her lawyers fought it. The case moved forward anyway. Ajax took his daughter out of Bellatrix's house 2 weeks after the lawsuit was filed. He moved them both into a small apartment 30 minutes away. It was the first time in 18 years he had lived outside his mother's property. He called me to tell me, and his voice sounded different, lighter. He said, "Larissa's letter asked me to get her out. It took me 18 years, but I did it. I did not go back to Augustin. I heard from Persephone a few months later that he moved back into his mother's house after the lawsuit was filed. I was not surprised. I went back to work. I see patients. I teach residents. On my desk, tucked behind a picture frame, is a photocopy of Larissa's letter. Not as evidence, as a reminder. Some exams you pass by refusing to sit for them. 3 weeks later, an envelope arrived at my apartment. No return address. Inside was a single photograph. Larissa, holding a newborn baby, sitting on a hospital bed. She was smiling. The photo was dated 4 days after the day she supposedly died.